how long does it take in the United States, most people, to go from recognizing, I'm not just sad, I'm kind of depressed, or I'm not just moody, I've got bipolar disorder. How long does it take from the first recognition of symptoms to getting help and treatment? The mean is 10 years, and in some cases, it's 15 to 20 years. Because people are too damn ashamed to admit it, and because the healthcare doesn't prioritize parity for mental health conditions. How are we going to get people involved in the treatments that work if there's a 10 or 20 year gap?
Welcome to the Deconstructionist Podcast, all you beautiful people out there. You laugh at everything I say.
I do. Because I never know what
laughing at me.
I never know what you're going to say. You always throw me off. Well, welcome back. This is a treat that we've been trying to curate for a long time. So we've been looking for, like we did kind of a mental health episode, just the two of us.
Very personal episode.
Yeah, like 2 years ago. But I'm by no means an expert, and we've wanted to get an expert on for quite some time. And wow, we got a heavy hitter here.
John roped in a whale of a guy here. Professor
and
Stephen Hinshaw.
Had no idea that Dr. Hinshaw was originally from our home state, Columbus, Ohio.
The epicenter of cultural and academic advancement in the modern world.
I believe it's true. Yeah. But he is, Dr. Hinshaw was gracious enough to come on our podcast and talk about a subject that is very near and dear to our hearts, and something that we really feel like, especially within Christianity and within the church as a whole, like there's a whole nother level of stigma and shame involved in the area of mental health. And so we got Dr. Hinshaw to come on. He is a professor of psychology at UC Berkeley and a professor of psychiatry at UC San Francisco. He's got 12 different books out, ranging from books on ADD to he's got a book out about the teenage girls and the unique pressures that they face in today's day and age. But his most recent one is really a personal book about his father, who, very much in the shadows and silence, suffered through his own mental health ordeal for the better part of multiple decades, and just the impact and the toll that has on your family and your loved ones around you. Not only just the person who's actually personally suffering from it. It's an incredible book.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, we go into some of these things in the episode, but with the rash of high-profile suicides and just a lot of the things that, we're all kind of just around the water cooler or, around the dinner table, just kind of becoming a bit more aware of what is going on. Like, what is going on? What the heck is going on? And the whole idea of stigmatization of mental health that we all sort of know is a problem, whether you have mental health or you know somebody that has mental health issues. Stigma is the biggest problem. And this book that Dr. Hinshaw penned, and then we based all of our interview around, called Another Kind of Madness, is exactly about the madness of silence and stigma, like how tragic and insane the stigma of mental health and the silence around mental health is. That's a madness all of itself. So this is a really important episode. Really serious, somber, heavy episode, but one that I also think that you guys will be energized by and filled with a lot of hope, because there's just so much to look at and listen to, and there's so much for all of us to just get better at in terms of engaging, whether it's with the illness that we find inside of ourselves or our families or our friends or our society. As he says later on in this episode, from the top down, from the bottom up, and from the middle out, we've got to do a better job at solving some of these problems around mental illness.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have anything else really to add because I just want people to get to the episode. But I think this is a long time coming, and I hope that people find value in this and find strength and freedom in some of the things that he says. And I just encourage people to go out, check out his talks. We'll put all the good bits and pieces into the show notes, but check out his book for sure. It's he's a really wonderful writer. It's a really fun and quick read. And he infuses in this very personal, loving tribute to his own father. He infuses a lot of like very important information about the progress that we've made in the mental health field, and all the I don't know, the things that we still have to accomplish yet in the field, all the things that we still need to work on, especially as a society, and the way that we support people who deal with mental illness. So highly recommend it. Go check it out. Check out the show notes as usual, and our website. And
without further ado, the Deconstructionist Podcast is honored to bring you our episode with Stephen freaking Hinshaw. All right, well, Professor Hinshaw, John and I are so excited to have this really important and I think timely conversation just based on a lot of the things that have been happening in the news and the media. So all the way from California, thank you for taking the time to be with us this afternoon for you, this evening for us.
I'm psyched. Let's get going. This is great.
Well, one of the things that we didn't realize when we first took a look at your book is that you're actually from Columbus as well. So we share that in common. So
I grew up in Columbus a long time ago, seemingly in the most idyllic household you could imagine. Dad was a professor of philosophy at Ohio State. Mom was an instructor in English, had studied history and languages in English. And my sister and I were treated to OSU 50-yard line C-deck seats because Dad had been professor a while. So we were in Ohio Stadium cheering on the Buckeyes back in the day. But underneath this seemingly perfect Midwestern veneer was the utter mystery and terror of his absences, 3 months, 6 months, or a year at a time. And my sister and I didn't know that Dad's doctor had told him, if you ever tell your children the reasons for your disappearances, you're going into mental hospitals, you have chronic schizophrenia, they'll be permanently destroyed. So silence ruled the day, shame and stigma. So in between this fabulous childhood was this utter mystery and a lot of self-blame, which is why I wrote Another Kind of Madness and got into the field of clinical psychology. Man,
so much there. Another Kind of Madness, I mean, when I read it and started to work through it, starting off with the quote in the beginning of the book by James Baldwin, where he says, the world mostly divided between madmen who remember and madmen who forget. And it goes on to say that stigma fosters this denial of human potential. So would it be accurate to say that the other kind of madness that you're talking about is the stigma that suggests we forget?
There's many forms of mental disorder. Schizophrenia, my dad was misdiagnosed with for 40 years. Bipolar disorder, which he actually had. Schizoaffective disorder, PTSD, autism, ADHD. We know a lot of research has been done since the time I was a kid to show what some of both the genes that make you vulnerable to these conditions, some of the early experiences and trauma that might make them even worse. We have evidence-based treatments for these now, even though we don't yet have cures. Mental illnesses carry a lot of impairment and tragedy for people and their families with them. But another kind of madness, quoting directly from Giovanni's Room and James Baldwin, is the stigma and shame that even today in 2018 cling and attach themselves to mental health issues. The stigma is a worse form of, quote, madness than schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, PTSD, That's why I titled the book this, because if we don't talk about it, if we don't deal openly with it, people aren't going to get help, and we're locked into a vicious cycle.
It's brilliant.
So the heart and soul of this book is you finally talking through this journey with your dad, because initially, early on, as you said, he did not disclose what was happening to you. All you knew as a child was that he would just disappear for long periods of time, and then
Right.
eventually he started to have these conversations in his study with you and reveal kind of what had happened. So talk a little bit about your dad and initially how you first came to understand what was going on.
So Dad grew up he was born right outside Chicago, fourth of four brothers. His dad was a Quaker prohibitionist, Virgil Hinshaw Sr. My dad was Virgil Jr., but Virgil Sr. helped to get the 18th Amendment passed back in 1919. Very strict Quaker upbringing. But the first tragedy occurred when Dad was 3, and his mother died at age 40 of cancer basically in a hospital bed in Chicago. If you lose a parent between 3 and 5, this puts you at pretty substantial risk for having a mood disorder like depression or bipolar disorder later in your life. If you're an infant, you kind of don't remember. If you're older, you can kind of verbally process, but 3 and 5 is a vulnerable age. Second, Dad clearly must have had a genetic liability. Bipolar disorder is one of the most, what's called heritable. In other words, the genetic liability is quite high compared to almost any other form of mental disorder. And then, as Dad grew up in Pasadena, his dad remarried. His mother had been a missionary. His stepmother was a missionary. His stepmother chose him, the youngest and smallest of the 4 original boys, before she and my grandfather had 2 more of their own, to single out for his academic and religious achievements, but also to punish him ritualistically for small infractions. So as Dad wrote in one of his journals much later, we would have never called it this back then in the 20s and 30s, but I believe that I was a victim of child abuse. We know that if you have the genetic liability for bipolar disorder and you've experienced physical or sexual abuse, and Dad experienced both, you're likely to have earlier appearing episodes. They're harder to treat, and the risk for ending your life is bipolar disorder has a high enough suicide risk. If you put the maltreatment together with it, it increases it even further. So Dad, at age 16, thought he was going to save the world from the fascists and the Nazis back in the 30s in Pasadena. The family had moved out west by jumping from the roof of the family home in Pasadena, thinking that his arms had become wings and the world's leaders would witness this magnificent signal. He'd gone 3 or 4 days without sleep. He was in a fast-developing manic episode full of grandiosity. He crashed down to the pavement below the 2nd floor of the house. He survived miraculously, was put in a back ward hospital for 6 months, where he almost starved himself because he believed the fascists were poisoning the food. Almost didn't make it between 16 and a half and 17, but quickly recovered without treatment. His only treatment then was being tied to his bed. There was no medications, no electroshock, no therapy. He recovered 6 months later, within a week, was sent home, started 12th grade, and the family didn't want to talk about it. They thought it might jinx his recovery.
Oh, my gosh.
Dad went on to Stanford for undergrad, Princeton for grad school. He studied with Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein at Princeton. Pretty darn good education.
Yeah.
But as he finished his degree, he thought he could predict the end of the Second World War via telepathy, got quite paranoid. 6 more months in a mental hospital, this one Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry, the little town that it was built in, now sort of a suburb of Philadelphia, before the hospital got torn down. Unbeknownst to him, the worst mental hospital in America, the subject of the film and book, The Snake Pit, where he was beaten each week by both staff and fellow inmates, and he thought he was in a concentration camp in Europe.
Oh my
Now,
God.
that was a crazy, delusional belief. He really wasn't. But when the photo exposés of Byberry came out, and then the websites developed, in the 90s, et cetera, the new men's dorm that opened in the 40s when Dad was there, 7,000 men in space for 1,500, regular beatings, regular deaths, not too far from the purposes of the Eastern European concentration camps. In some ways, Dad had a metaphorical truth about what the state hospitals were like in the United States, which wasn't so far off from what the concentration camps in Europe were doing. So Dad had these brilliant periods of utter normality and these very wild periods of mania, and then mania mixed with depression together, and his only treatment was to be put in some of the country's worst mental hospitals. All through, he became a professor at Ohio State. Once he got out, met my mother, a grad student in history. They fell in love. Dad didn't want to talk about his past much. Would you marry someone back then in the late 40s, early 50s who had lifelong schizophrenia? Of course not. But he would vanish when my mom became pregnant with me and then with my sister, all through our childhood, again hospitalized for these wild, inexplicable episodes. But that's when his lead psychiatrist told him, if you ever tell your children where you've ended up, they'll be permanently destroyed. Your wife and you are forbidden from ever mentioning the topic.
Wow.
This is the shame. This is the stigma. What do kids do when something's not going right at home, but nobody talks about it? Well, in a nutshell, I guess kids can, A, start to think that the world's a horrible, random, cruel place. That's not a very good attribution to make. Or B, blame themselves. At least you have some control. Maybe if I had been a better son, Dad wouldn't have disappeared. And if I didn't ask Mom any questions, because she made it clear that she wouldn't really tend to them, then he'd come back sooner. It must have been my fault. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until I went back east to college and came home for my first spring break. I just turned 18. Dad pulled me in a study back home, started to talk about leading with, son, perhaps you should hear some incidents from my life. And I began to realize what my first 18 years had been filled with was the silence and shame around mental illness. So in some ways, this was a liberation. Now I knew what was going on, and I was going to become a psychology major and solve my dad's issues and solve mental health issues around the world. But I was also terrified because I figured I'd be next, because I did learn early in college that schizophrenia had a high genetic loading, as did bipolar disorder. So because I wasn't talking with anyone, roommates, friends, girlfriends, I shared the stigma. And until I started to open up myself, I became dedicated to the mental health fields, but I was also terrified that I'd be next to go to a snake pit and maybe never come out.
My gosh. It reminds me something we've talked about before on the podcast. It seems like one of the general rules in life, and I know that you're crusading in this direction with the thrust of your work, but burying things doesn't really help, but it's confronting our pain that often brings us to our purpose. And so much of our study is often to understand ourselves better, and what you're doing right now by understanding the pain of your own childhood and your father is becoming a huge gift to countless people. I wonder if you could say a few words about how confronting some of these things that are ugly in our lives can actually lead to healing for so many people.
You'd like to think that if you're talking with somebody who's pretty depressed and is worried about whether life is worth living, well, you don't want to bring up that topic of suicide because you might suggest it. Believe me, the person who's been depressed has been thinking about that for some time. Now you've opened the door for some dialogue.
Wow.
You wouldn't necessarily want to talk to me when I was younger about your dad apparently had chronic schizophrenia, had ended up in these snake pit-like hospitals. How shameful, we'll never talk about it. By opening up gradually and talking about it, you can deal with it. You can deal with the trauma. You can deal with the fact that you're part of a doomed family. But maybe it's not doomed if you can get help. I tried to get help from my dad. I finally diagnosed him correctly with bipolar disorder once I got out of college, before I even started at school. One of his older brothers, who'd witnessed him splayed on the sidewalk beneath the house back in 1936, had become a psychiatrist and psychologist, inspired by his younger brother's tragic circumstances. And my uncle and I got Dad a correct diagnosis of bipolar disorder, treatment with lithium. And for the first time, by that point, going on 55 years of his life, Dad had some peace and had some symptom-free years because we talked about it and dealt with it. So your theme is exactly right. Keeping things buried and suppressing emotions usually doesn't have a good outcome. Now, does that mean that and I've been depressed in my life, I've got the genetic liability, I carried this burden, do I wear a sandwich board saying, Dad had bipolar and I've been depressed? Probably I don't confront the world telling everybody I know first thing. Disclosure is a matter of timing, rehearsal, and support. But we can never go to the default that my family grew up with, which is if you ever talk about it, you'll be permanently banished. If silence and shame and stigma are the default, we're never going to get anywhere as a society.
So one of the things that before, because I'd love to get into kind of your later life when you and your dad really had this closer connection and were able to talk about this stuff. But one of the things that was really profound to me was when you were talking about just kind of how you dealt with it as a child, and you recount this conversation that you had with a young friend of yours by the name of Brian, where Brian is recounting the fact that his father had passed away, and you had mentioned that you felt like, in a way, it would have almost been better off if your father had also been deceased, because at least then there would have been some level of certainty. And yeah.
This was third grade. We'd moved the summer after second grade to our new house, even a little closer to the Ohio State campus, a couple miles from our first house. All excited about the move. We moved in, and then a few weeks later, Dad was gone. I started third grade at the new school, and all fall, all winter, all spring, he wasn't back. And I thought, where is he? Is he dead or alive?
Man.
I got brave that fall and asked Mom one day at the kitchen table where Dad was. And she said, she looked me in the eye with a kind of look that told me, don't ask anymore, saying, your father's resting in California, Steve. It's best if you ask no more questions. Wow. So that was as much as the doctor had allowed her. So I thought, he rests in California. Why does he need so much rest? Is it all the books he reads and the philosophy courses he teaches? What did I do wrong? I made a friend, Brian, with that spring when I was starting to play Little League baseball. Went over to his house. It was kind of a refuge from all this worry I had about where Dad was. But Brian said, Daddy's up in heaven behind those clouds there. He died. He got very sick a couple of years ago. I didn't know what to say because at least, just as you mentioned, at least Brian knew that his dad had passed away. I didn't know if my dad was hiding out or dead, or no one could talk about where he was living. The uncertainty in some ways and the shame underneath it may be worse than any truth. At least with truth, you can deal with it and you know what it is and you can cope with it. But when everything's sliding down a slippery slope of shame and silence, you don't know how to deal with anything.
Gosh.
I wonder if you might, I think it might be helpful because we throw the word stigma around a lot. I wonder if you could just offer maybe a little bit of an explanation, as a professor, we're your students here today. What is stigma and why is it such a problem? I think it might be worth pausing just for a second to make sure we're all on the same page, 'cause it's kind of a big deal.
And in this memoir, Another Kind of Madness, I periodically pause from my childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and my dad's saga to define this term. And so, without making it too heavy-handed or too much like a lecture course, stigma is a Greek term. Many psychological and psychiatric terms have their origins in the Greek language. Stigma back in the day, say in ancient Athens, let's say you were walking in the agora, the marketplace. Mm-hmm. So agoraphobia, which many people have heard of, literally means fear of the marketplace, fear of being out in public. But let's say I was walking as a Greek citizen, an Athenian citizen back there. I might be curious if some of my fellow shoppers at the agora had actually fought for Sparta or maybe had been a former slave. Well, how would I know? well, there was a brand burned into their neck and shoulder. Everybody knew. Stigma literally means a mark, a brand mark, a burn, so that everybody in society knows you're low status.
Wow.
Now, Hitler branded people in concentration camps with numbers on their wrist.
Mm-hmm.
Some countries 30 years ago, when the HIV epidemic became very widespread, would brand HIV positive people so you'd know to stay away from them. Most stigma today, though, isn't a physical mark, it's a psychological mark. You had a dad, Steve, who had schizophrenia supposedly and ended up in the country's worst mental hospitals. You're a religious minority. Well, here's another example of stigma. You're left-handed. Back when we were growing up, my sister turned out to be left-handed, and my grandmother on my mom's side didn't want her to be left-handed. Today, that's not much of a stigma. It's like if you're left-handed, you've got good spatial abilities, and you go to MIT. You're kind of cool.
Right.
But
or a left-handed pitcher.
as society changes, some things that are make you a moral outcast can change. But the sad fact is, the tragic fact is today, what are the three groups in our society who receive more shame and stigma? Not the physical brand, but the psychological and then any others. Do you have a mental illness? Are you homeless? And or do you have a substance use problem? Do you use drugs, illicit drugs? Those are the three lowest on the totem pole conditions. They receive more stigma than any other groups. That hasn't changed in a couple of centuries. Why? We know tons more about mental illness. We can treat it. We can identify certain genes that may be markers for it. But we're still afraid. We don't talk about it much. Back before I was born, back in the 30s and 40s and early 50s of the last centuries, if your aunt or grandfather, whoever died of cancer, you would never put that in the obituary as a cause of death. Died of natural causes, died of an unknown illness, because cancer was a very stigmatized disease. You obviously got cancer because you didn't have the moral fortitude to fight it off. What? Well, today, cancer is a cause. Breast cancer, what's going to happen a couple of afternoons, Sunday afternoons this fall in the NFL? The big behemoths are going to be wearing pink knee socks to dedicate themselves to fighting breast cancer. Because women have told their stories, and it's not acceptable to be silent and be ashamed of cancer. We haven't moved the dial on mental health and mental illness. We know more than in the 50s. There's psychology courses in high schools. The media do a better job of talking about it. But the more we know, in some ways, we're still afraid. What's the public face of mental illness these days? Deranged-looking guys in their 20s who are school shooters.
Yeah.
Or the people out here in California I see living under the freeways, chronically homeless, chronically mentally ill. If we could open up the dialogue the way we have about cancer, make it a parallel with mental health issues, Congress wouldn't fund mental health treatment and research at a lower level than physical health treatment. People wouldn't be ashamed to get a diagnosis and get therapy or medication if medication's needed. We're still just coming out of the dark ages because we're pretty terrified. Gee, if we think that that person has a mental illness, maybe my own hold on my mental faculties isn't so good. Better keep it silent, keep the strong, be the strong silent type, keep the poker face about it, because we're still too afraid. This is the battle right now to overcome stigma.
So to kind of continue on off of what you just said, because I think one of the quotes you have in the book really just kind of like swept me out my feet. I couldn't believe it. But I think that with all of the, like you said, school shootings that are happening in the news and all these horrific, violent crimes, there's a quote that you say in the book where you say, in reality, individuals with mental illness are far more likely to be victimized by violence than others, but with rare exceptions, no more likely to commit aggression. So part of me is like, why don't we hear more about that in the news? Versus, it seems to me like every time there's a shooting in the news, the first thing that pops up is, well, this person must have been mentally ill. They must be.
He was a crazed lunatic.
Yeah.
Lunatic, psycho, violent. So certainly if you have untreated paranoid schizophrenia, or very rare in bipolar disorder, the feeling that everyone's out to get you and you've got to act first. Without treatment, psychosis, hallucinations, and delusions, if it becomes paranoid, that raises the risk of committing violent behavior. That is under 2% of people with all forms of mental illness. And if people are treated, that risk goes down to zero. Far more, just as you pointed out, and thanks for catching the quote, people who've got serious mental illness who often lose their education and income are very likely to be victimized by violence rather than perpetrate it. But that's not the stereotype, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. All of the, well, what did kids see growing up when they were my age or a little bit younger than I? Looney Tunes cartoons. There's Daffy Duck, right? He's Daffy. He's mentally ill. The stereotypes of being incompetent or violent have in some ways trumped the actual fact that most people, the vast majority of people with mental health issues, are desperate to get help, are no more likely to be violent than anybody else. There's exceptions if you're extremely paranoid. But even if you've got those kind of conditions, if you get treatment, your risk of violence goes right back down to the base rate. So we're swamped in a sea of stereotypes that's preventing us from moving the dial.
And there's something that you said a moment ago that just a lot of people that listen to our podcast have struggled with different things from a religious perspective that have caused them a great deal of confusion and are kind of wrestling through it. And you had mentioned how HIV and even cancer back in the day, I think it was in the book you said, if a relative died of cancer in, the 30s, 40s, 50s, you wouldn't even put it in the obituary, right?
That's right.
Because there's this old sort of, I don't know if it's Protestant or puritanical or, whatever, but this inherited religious view that's become sort of the American religious consciousness that you get what you deserve. And so if you're mentally ill, I wonder how much you've seen, I think ideas are really, really powerful, and, religious ideas are really, really powerful, and how much has our religious consciousness as a nation contributed to this over-stigmatization of mental illness, in your opinion?
A fascinating question, and I would expand religious to the moral perspective altogether.
Completely. I mean it in almost like a secular consciousness kind of way, not one particular religion.
75 years ago, again, cancer was viewed in moral terms. You didn't have the kind of moral character or deep inner strength to fight the cancer. You had succumbed. You were inherently, you were a cancerite. You were a victim of this illness because you didn't have the courage or strength. Well, today we think that's preposterous, right? A lot of people my age, some people your age wear glasses. Did you lack the moral fiber to have your eye muscles work correctly? It was crazy to even think about that as an idea.
Yeah.
But if it's your behavior, if it's, can you pay attention in class, ADHD, you have some of these beliefs that most people don't. Do you really think your life is so unworth living that you would consider ending it, suicidal depression? That feels to us as though any behavior that you exhibit must be the result of your personal volition and will. Now, we don't want to make the mistake of saying all behavior is simply a function of genes, and all genes are simply a function of chemicals and physics, and everything's reduced to quarks and atoms. That's too deterministic.
Yeah.
Certainly when people have mental illnesses, they and their families need to get motivated to get them treatment. But if the predominant belief is it's shameful, you can't even admit it, then we're stuck where it's the ultimate vicious cycle. The paradox is, if you go to your doctor for a physical health issue, you get treatment. You get some benefit often. If you go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist for mental health treatment, on average, you get a bigger bang for your buck than you go to for your doctor for a physical health illness. But that's not the stereotype. The stereotype is once mentally ill, always mentally ill, and it's because you didn't have this fortitude or strength. We've moralized it, even though we know these are actual genetically liable illnesses, but we still think somewhere underneath there's some moral failing, whether it's traditional religion, whether it's you didn't have the fortitude to fight it off. So you're lower than the low. You're the lowest of the low. The stigma attaches to, well, what did we used to think? back in the so-called Dark Ages, mental illness, animal spirits or evil spirits. But you must have been a weak person to let those spirits overtake you.
Mm-hmm.
Mental illness is still ensconced in a kind of moralistic way of thinking about behavior is all under personal control.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer. Yeah, I really appreciate that.
Sure.
It actually reminds me of another quote that I remember, that I recall from your book, where you talk about the I don't know if it's the appropriate approach or a better approach to the mental health field, but the only accurate stance is one of humility and integration of diverse perspectives.
Oh yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Thank you for capturing that quote in your memory. When I was old enough to have my dad talk to me, my parents should have talked to me earlier, and family therapy would do that now. But I was 18, going into college. I started to learn from Dad about the therapies he'd received that were not very effective or helpful. He was on the wrong medication and the wrong kind of electric shock treatment for decades because he had the wrong diagnosis. If we don't diagnose well, if we don't take mental health issues seriously, people's treatments aren't going to help them. They're going to actually, in some ways, make things worse. And think of the attitudes. Are you brave enough to go get chemotherapy or radiation for your cancer? We're going to support you through it. You're going to go see a shrink? You're going to take psych pills? What's the matter with you? Can't you fight this yourself? I've been depressed too. I don't wake up every day smiling. You must be kind of really not the kind of person I am if you admit depression and take pills for it. We've got this fundamental attitude toward mental health and treatment that's dehumanizing. It's belittling rather than empowering. And we've got, back to the quote, it's either a moral flaw or psychologically you had bad parenting, or your brain chemistry's all wrong and we got to medicate you. It's either biological or psychosocial. No, in fact, it's both at the same time.
Yeah.
Some people are genetically more liable to coronary artery disease and cancer, but lifestyle choices can exacerbate that.
Yep.
Some people are more genetically liable to depression or bipolar disorder or PTSD than others, but the life experiences can still shape that. It's not either or, it's both and. Finally, humility. I'm glad you remembered that. Some of my dad's doctors that he would report about, and other relatives of mine who grappled with pretty serious mental illness. The stories are the doctors would say, leave him or her with me, I'll give them therapy and cure them, or only medication works. It's either or, and we know everything. If you get into the field of psychology, psychiatry, neurology, social work, the only stance is humility. We know a lot more than 56 years ago, but what we really know is how much we still need to learn. We've got to fund the science, we've got to promote humanity, and be kind of humble about the brain is the most complicated thing we know of in the universe. Each of us is sitting here inside our skulls with 100 billion neuron cells, each making 1,000 or more connections with others, 100 plus trillion synapses. No computer can yet do what the brain can do to recognize faces or process emotions. No wonder mental health is complicated. But the stereotype is either or we know it all among too many mental health professionals and scientists. So what I try to do when I teach at UC Berkeley and UC San Francisco is infuse the excitement about what a field to integrate neuroscience, genetics, public health, education, psychology, but not to pretend that we have answers yet. We've got more answers than we did, but we've got a long way to go.
That's so good. And it's perfect for another question that I wanted to ask you about. I was reading one of a book of a contemporary of yours, Bessel van der Kolk. And he wrote The Body Keeps the Score. And there was a lot in that book that resonated with some of the things that I was picking up in your book too, around the DSM and how the system of reimbursements and insurance and money and an underlying I think, problem in our culture that you were just pointing to with this over need for certainty all the time and a lack of humility. I wonder how much do these rush diagnoses, if people see it in the DSM-5, I think it is now, and you spend a couple visits with somebody, you just got to rush to a diagnosis. How much is that contributing to the problem that we're talking about right now?
Well, I think a lot. And so let's kind of back into two phases here. What makes science science? Chemistry, the periodic table of the elements, right?
Sure.
It helps organize. Well, in psychiatry and clinical psychology, the DSM, rather than just talking about 1,000 different symptoms, maybe they cluster into syndromes and disorders. But the first problem is mental health issues don't fall into the nice, neat categorical boxes of depression or PTSD or ADHD. People's emotions and behaviors and brains are a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah.
Number two, to make an accurate diagnosis, given that it's not a perfect system anyway, if you're diagnosing someone with bipolar disorder and they're in an episode, are you going to trust their views? No, you've got to talk to their parents or their loved ones. You've got to get a history. There's lab tests to be gotten. There's tests to be. If you're going to diagnose a kid with ADHD, I do a lot of work in the area of ADHD. Do you think a pediatrician in 10 minutes can sort out who's just a slightly more than normal active level kid, who is in a terrible school, who's been the victim of physical abuse, and who actually has ADHD? This is going to take a few hours.
Jeez.
Interviewing parents, observing in classrooms, getting ratings, giving tests. Most people get diagnosed by a non-specialist in 10 to 12 minutes.
Yep.
No wonder people get underdiagnosed and overdiagnosed. And in my work on ADHD, my colleague Richard Scheffler, a health economist here at Berkeley, we teamed up, got grants together, wrote the book together called The ADHD Explosion. We know that ADHD is a real condition, but it can get overdiagnosed if two things happen. School districts think that the only thing worthwhile about a kid and a school is the test scores produced. Yep. And if the diagnoses are done in a quick and dirty fashion. In those regions of the country where achievement test scores are prioritized above all else, and you can get a quick and dirty diagnosis, the poorest kids in that community will jump up in ADHD diagnoses 50 to 60% within a couple of years because it's a convenient label and because maybe those kids, interestingly, wouldn't count in the district's test score average next time around because they're special ed kids. So it's almost like gaming the system to overdiagnose, to raise our national obsession with test scores. We've got to take diagnosis and assessment seriously. We've got to make the right diagnosis when we can so that people can get help. Does everybody have major depression? Does everybody have ADHD? No. But in some days in our country now, it's almost like a badge of courage to get the diagnosis. So we're in this stigmatized area. And if the diagnoses are given out like the stigma increases against people with real depression or ADHD because everybody thinks they're just faking it.
That's fascinating because my wife in particular also was diagnosed with ADHD at a young age. Yep. And was actually put on a clinical study to see if there was a market for a much higher dosage of a drug. I believe it was Concerta at the time. And it almost seemed, at least from her perspective, as if the treatment was more so to modify her behavior so that she was an acceptable student in class compared to everyone else versus actually treating the actual underlying issues.
Yeah.
Is that your experience as well in these studies? Is that some of the information that's coming out of these?
Well, we still have a lot of myth about behavior control. Gee, if I have bipolar disorder, don't put me on a mood stabilizer. It'll squelch my creativity and productivity. Well, in fact, mood stabilizing medications save lives. The most lethal form of mental illness we know of is bipolar disorder. 40% of people with bipolar disorder untreated will attempt their lives, and a third to almost a half of those people will complete suicide. Getting on lithium, getting on a mood stabilizer may actually save your life, but if you're misdiagnosed and you're put on these medications just for behavior control, that's 1984. For ADHD, if you get a real accurate diagnosis of ADHD, the medication doesn't just stifle your behavior. It actually helps you learn better in the classroom and use your creativity and your smarts better. But if you want to keep a poorly managed classroom sort of depleted of complaining students, you get everybody on medication and they're more docile. Medication, same for psychotherapy. Everything has intended and unintended consequences. If we don't bother to diagnose accurately, treatments can become agents of social control. On the other hand, back to bipolar disorder, many artists, performers, scientists think, gee, don't treat my bipolar disorder. I won't be as productive or creative. Once, if they actually have bipolar disorder, they get on the right medication, they're much more productive than before, because if you're manic, you can't complete a project. You think you're more creative, but you're not actually, because you can't follow it through. So medications can be lifesavers for ADHD, for bipolar disorder, for major depression. But if everybody gets them and they're handed out like candy without accurate diagnoses, A, there's health risks, and B, it's going to further stigmatize mental illness.
Talk about that a little bit too, because you do a great job in the book of talking about how far the mental health field has come in a very short span of time, just throughout the lifespan of your father, where there was no treatment other than to strap him down initially. And
right.
that, of course, evolved into electroshock therapy and some other treatments. And then obviously now there's a whole host of different medications that are available. So talk a little bit about the progress that we've made.
And even electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, even though most people stereotype is one flew over the cuckoo's nest,
sure,
is going to be used punitively, and who wants to get their head shocked. If you've got major depression and you're not very responsive to medications or psychotherapy, the way ECT is done now, very short pulses, lots of combinations with individual and family therapy, it can pull you out of a depression better and faster than any medication we know. But again, that's the accuracy of the diagnosis. What's the big point here? We need to fund research to know both the genes that make people vulnerable, the early life experiences, and do an even better job of developing and promoting psychotherapy, better medications, and often it's the combination of the work I do with ADHD. Some kids with ADHD do pay attention better than in class. But if you don't work with the kid and the school and the family, the kid may be slightly more compliant, but isn't going to learn or make friends better. It's, again, the integration. Medicine for the most severe forms of mental illness in combination with individual, family, school therapies, that's going to bring people the skills they need rather than just, well, I guess we better keep people under better control. Let's give them medication and hardly monitor it and not back that up with therapy.
Well, my wife will be very pleased to hear you say that. She has stories that are horrific to me. She has one where they literally pulled her desk out of her class and stuck her in the corner because she had troubles focusing. Yeah, and it's like, so I think I related a lot of that to kind of where you talk about like the just the effects that it has that still are carried on years after. You know, she's been out of school for quite some time. So
quite some time, and so just a la this all too common story related to people like your wife. Here in Berkeley, we have the largest study of girls with ADHD in the world.
Wow.
Following them from girlhood to adolescence to the earliest years of adulthood, now to their mid to late 20s. It's bad for a boy to have ADHD, even though, you know, some people say, well, it's just all boys, the Tom Sawyer syndrome, which is inaccurate. But if you're a girl and you don't focus well in class and you blow out the birthday candles at the birthday party, but it's your friend's birthday, not yours, so you lose, you're impulsive. The consequences of ADHD for girls as they grow up are actually worse than those for boys because it's gender atypical. We're in fact finding, tragically, that girls with early ADHD, especially if they're quite impulsive, not just inattentive, but quite impulsive as girls, their risk for serious cutting and other forms of self-injury and suicide attempts, it's 1 in 4 to 1 in 3.
Man. Ooh.
Even something as you say, well, ADHD isn't as serious as bipolar disorder. If you're a girl and you don't get treatment early, the consequences can be devastating because, again, it's gender atypical. There must be really something wrong with you or your family if you're a girl exhibiting those behaviors.
No one's left to pull me inside the toxic memories. Killing time with kindness reserves your bed beneath the weeds. No one's left to pull me in. Take a rest beneath the weeds.
Wow.
I know we've maybe got a couple questions left for you, but I'm thinking right now of our listener who's sitting here listening to this episode and getting the gist of your work. Hopefully they're going to go out and buy this book because they'll enjoy it immensely and learn a lot from it. But getting a little bit more practical here. So how do we start to, let's imagine we're somebody that needs to have a conversation, or let me back up even. What are some practical ways that we and our listeners and anybody else that's interested can start to break down stigma?
Yeah. So it's a deceptively simple and very complex question. How do we deal with climate change? How do we deal with racial prejudice? How do we deal with the big issues of our day? No single strategy is going to work.
Right?
We're going to have to go top down, bottom up, and middle out. So let's take stigma. It's now illegal because of the Americans with Disabilities Act, celebrating its 28th anniversary this summer, signed into law by first George Bush in 1990. It's illegal to be discriminated against in our country if you have a physical or mental disability in public or in the workplace. That's great. It's a civil right. But if you're on the job and you're getting discriminated against, you've got to go to HR or go to your boss and say, I've got depression, or I've got PTSD, or I've got agoraphobia, or claustrophobia. I can't take the elevator up to the fifth floor, and I need an accommodation. The vast majority of suits brought under ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, are from people in wheelchairs who need a ramp or a wider door to their office. People are too ashamed to bring up their mental health issues for fear they'll get fired.
Yeah.
So it's not just policy. We got to enforce anti-discrimination. We need parity. You get the same healthcare coverage for mental health issues as you do for physical. That's top down. That's great. But if we don't open the dialogue, if we make it so that you're still too ashamed to go see a shrink, to go see a therapist, if we make it too shameful for you to admit to a friend or coworker, no matter schoolmate, that I need some help, we've lost the battle.
Yeah.
I'm going to quote a statistic here that's our colleague at Harvard School of Public Health, Ron Kessler, who's a mental health epidemiologist. He's been studying this topic at kind of the 30,000 foot level for a while now. In one of his big studies done a few years ago now, he got a bead on, this is adults now, not kids, who have mental health conditions. And he did with a subsample of them, not just their questionnaires, but interviews. Long story short, how long does it take in the United States, most people, to go from recognizing, I actually am not just sad, I'm kind of depressed, or I'm not just moody, I've got bipolar disorder. How long does it take from the first recognition of symptoms to getting help and treatment? The mean is 10 years, and in some cases, it's 15 to 20 years. Because people are too damn ashamed to admit it, and because the healthcare doesn't prioritize parity for mental health conditions. How are we going to get people involved in the treatments that work if there's a 10 or 20 year gap? Top down anti-discrimination, bottom up changing people's ways of disclosing. If you know somebody well and they admit to a mental health issue, you want to support them, not reject them. And middle out, what are we going to do in the middle to go up and down? A different set of media images. It's worked for cancer. We've got a long way to go with mental health. The main headlines still are violence and incompetence. Yes, there's more human interest stories. Yes, there's more nuance. But if you look systematically, it hasn't changed much in 50 or 60 years. The LEDE lead for most media on mental health issues is you're dangerous, violent, or incompetent.
Wow. One of the things before we let you go that I feel like we want to pick your brain about, just because it's been so heavy in the news, especially this last year, that to me seems like if it was any other disease, it would be considered an epidemic by this point, and you would think that our country would have mobilized in some fashion. But it's the issue of suicide, and and there's a stat that you give at the end of your book where you talk about the fact that as of 2014, 3 times more Americans die from suicide than from homicide, and then you go on to give some other equally impactful statistics as well. So, is this becoming some sort of epidemic, and what's going on? How do we help fix this problem?
Well, we'll need 5 more podcasts for that because it's a huge issue. But in all seriousness, so we're now in August of 2018, and earlier this summer, as just about every American knows, from the headlines, Kate Spade, and then a few days later, Anthony Bourdain had ended their lives by suicide.
Yeah.
What some people missed is right in between, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention publicized their latest national statistics on suicide. And what everybody thinks is true. Suicide rates have gone up palpably in the United States. 1998 to 2008 to 2018, the last 20 years, for kids, for teens, for young adults, middle-aged adults, and older adults. The number 2 cause of death around the world, first world, second world, third world, for girls 15 to 19 is now suicide.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, there is, now, be a sociologist. Is it life stress? Is it the vulnerable genes we have getting exacerbated by social media? Social media, a good thing or a bad thing? Again, we could take a lot of podcasts to get into that. But the point is, most cases of people who get to the point of feeling their life isn't worth living have an underlying mental health condition that is treatable if you can get into treatment, if you're not too ashamed to admit it, if we have the right health insurance to reimburse it. One of the statistics that came out back about 6 weeks ago when the CDC released their data was, they said, it's interesting in our statistics, for the first time, more than 50% of suicides that we documented through these national data were not associated with a known cause of mental illness. What's the key word in that sentence? Known cause.
Yeah.
Right? Are you going to admit to depression or bipolar or PTSD, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Now, certainly, you don't have to have a chronic mental disease to feel that your life isn't worth living. Life is getting more stressful. But if we added known and unknown or unadmitted causes, the vast majority of people who come to this terrible point of feeling their life isn't worth living have been dealing with depression, anxiety, and other symptoms of mental health issues, obviously and quite honestly, for a long time, and get to the point of hopelessness.
Wow.
Man. It's heavy. It's heavy.
It's very heavy, but the good news is there's hope. I know we've got to wrap up, but one of the things we're doing, I work with a group called Bring Change to Mind. This is Glenn Close's anti-stigma organization.
So glad you brought it up. Yes.
Glenn called me 6 springs ago. I was walking across the Berkeley campus from my lecture to go play basketball, which I try to keep full court basketball up to keep my own mental health alive. And Glenn cold called me, said, I know about your work, Dr. Hinshaw, on mental health and stigma. Would you become a scientific advisor to Bring Change to Mind? I have, and for the last 6 years, I've helped with and helped witness Bring Change to Mind is doing a lot. Public service announcements, ending the stigma of mental illness at that level, but also working with college students and even high school students, not necessarily those with depression or bipolar disorder or anxiety disorders. We have high school clubs now. We've got 180 clubs starting this fall in a couple weeks around the United States. Chess club, rugby club, Latin club, the Stigma club at your high school, where the kids create the curriculum creatively with our guidebook to talk with themselves and their families and school administrators and teachers in their community about ending the stigma. I think in 10 or 20 years, as these high school students, their social activism and their empathy is off the charts.
It is.
We're going to have the change in dialogue about mental health that we've had with cancer earlier, and we've got to start young. It's not just teaching the facts. If you teach high school kids, here's what schizophrenia is, here's what depression is, they'll learn the symptoms, and they'll become more stigmatizing at the end of the semester.
Yeah.
They learn the stereotype. The humanization and the social action and the self-discovery is improving attitudes and making kids feel like they've got to do something to end stigma. So I wanted to end on this positive note that if we can start young with young people moving forward, I think our society will change over the next 20, 30, 40 years in terms of fundamental attitudes toward mental health.
I 100% agree with you. I believe that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we absolutely, I mean, we had probably 3 or 4 more pages of notes. We could keep going forever, but perhaps another time. But before we let you go, where can people go to keep on top of what you're up to and to find out more about these clubs that you're talking about and find your books?
So my latest book, I'm on my 12th of 12, is Another Kind of Madness, A Journey Through the Stigma, Hope of Mental Illness. St. Martin's came out last year in 2017. You can go to Amazon. You can go to Stephen Hinshaw Author. That's Stephen with a PH. StephenHinshawAuthor.com. That's my author website. Bring Change to Mind. Bring Change, numeral 2, mind.org is the website, which will tell you all about the public service announcements, the college program, the high school program, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, NAMI is another place to go. Google me, Stephen with a PH, Hinshaw, get a list of the talks I'm doing and lectures I've given, other projects I'm involved with. Talk about your feelings of vulnerability with your friends, your loved ones. Keeping it silent, maintaining that MO isn't going to work any longer. And I think that's the single biggest thing we can do.
Amen to that.
Oh, man. Well, the book is incredible. I highly encourage everyone to go out and get it. It's a absolutely beautiful tribute to your late father and your family, and just a beautiful way to bring a personal aspect into talking about a very important issue, definitely to us. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me on. I'd love to be back on another podcast whenever the time is right.
Absolutely.
And this is a cause everyone will benefit from personally and in terms of their family and friends and the whole society. It's not a sign of weakness to get help, see a shrink, get therapy. It's a sign of strength. Do we let our cars run into the ground? No, we get tune-ups. Same thing for our emotional well-being and mental health. And thanks for having me on.
You're amazing. So yeah, I think a round 2 is in order. We'll be in touch.
Thanks so much.
Thanks
Take care,
so
you
much.
guys.
Thanks,
You
Stephen.
too.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye-bye.
Eyes wide and wasting, wishbones broken. I want it all, but everything won't fit.
Well, that hour just flew by.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few episodes that we've done in the past where I legit have probably 2 pages worth of notes left over that I'm like, could have definitely gone there. But, there's certain questions, obviously, like when you get a guest like this, you want to make sure that you cover. And so definitely, could definitely easily do another episode with him, and hopefully in the future we will. But gosh, like I can't get over it. I mean, I underlined and I highlight a lot to begin with, but I underlined and highlighted a ton in this book.
Oh, there's so many pearls, I'll call them. Just gems. And not just information, but perspectives, I think.
Yeah.
Obviously there's a lot of great information, but you find that those aha moments, as the great Oprah Winfrey would call
Yes.
them, those aha moments usually come when you realize that someone has a perspective that's far more clear or helpful than the one that you currently have. And sometimes it's just a small turn of phrase that can give you a new perspective. And around mental illness, so many connections between other things, like his whole take on faith. I mean, we could have talked about that all day long, and how this old sort of blue-collar American dream kind of faith consciousness that we have writ large in our culture all over the place. It's just, ubiquitous. And our culture has created so many problems for so many people. Just mentioning a few, cancer patients in the early 1900s to 1950s were stigmatized. HIV patients in the 80s and 90s, people that contracted those viruses or illnesses, were stigmatized because of this faith conscious of pick yourself up by your bootstraps, try harder. If something has happened to you, it's probably, coming back upon your head, from if you're reaping what you've sowed, as it were, all these other pithy bumper sticker theologies that become part of the cultural consciousness. He could have gone on about that all day for me. And since stigma is what we're talking about, what becomes a bigger driver of stigma than faith consciousness?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and there's so many different facets to dealing with mental illness. I mean, he briefly touched on the fact that mental illness affects young teenage women differently than it does men, and specifically with young women who are suffering from or dealing with ADHD, and likewise, he talks about with men. We've talked about it before, where young men, it's kind of this weird stigma in and of itself, where it's like, well, just buck up, like you're just not tough enough. Then
just sit still.
If you're sad, you're like, oh, you're sad.
Yeah, that too.
That's cute,
Oh,
It's like it's this weird, like, hyper masculine mentality that is bled over from prior generations that still exists, and until we can get past this idea that it's some sort of like weakness or deficiency in the person, then the people who need the help the most aren't going to get it.
Totally.
So yeah, there were some statistics in the end of the book that just kind of blew me away. And one of the things that we didn't get a chance to talk about is where he's having this conversation later in his dad's life, and his dad said, there are times I wish that I had cancer instead. And he's kind of like, what? And he's like, yeah, because, he's just kind of recounting the fact that to have a physical illness is more accepted than having a mental illness. And I mean, that just speaks oceans in terms of where we are, the disparity between the way that we treat mental illnesses and physical illnesses, and how far we have yet to go.
I think that so much of what you're talking about right here deals with something that has come up on our podcast so many times in so many different ways. I'm thinking about Pauline Boss right now, and our episode with Pauline Boss on ambiguous loss. So we have such a low tolerance for ambiguity in our culture that you would rather have something that feels more definite and concrete, because just like, the old, like, I think was it Stephen King? I think that said, there's nothing scarier than just the unknown.
Yeah, I think so.
I don't know. I always attribute that to Stephen King. I'm probably wrong. Somebody fact check that for me.
He's written plenty, so there's a good chance.
But there is this thing that, we are especially in our hyper-rational, addicted to certainty culture, we are far more terrified of that which we can't name or know, because we're so uncomfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity, that we would rather have something like a tumor than this kind of, nebulous, foggy idea of mental illness.
Yeah.
Which is such a problem. We are so addicted to certainty that we can't even venture into the realms of our humanity that we need to venture into, because we don't have great labels. And so we rush to things like the DSM-5. If you don't know what that is, it's the diagnostic manual used by mental health professionals to identify and diagnose disorders. And we, rush to these labels because, I got it now. At least I know what it is.
Yeah. Yeah, and just by the nature of mental health, or mental illness rather, is there's so many, as Dr. Hinshaw talked about, there's so many different factors that contribute to mental illness. It's not like, oh, well, you have strep throat, so we're going to give you penicillin to treat it. It's pretty straightforward. This is what it is, and this is what we give you to treat it.
Right.
Well, that is not the case, and it's not necessarily, treatment for me dealing with depression is not necessarily the same treatment that you're going to receive. So, for me, I need a combination of therapy, like as my dad calls it, I go to the talk doc, and also my body just doesn't produce, enough serotonin. And so I need medication as well. And so the dosage that I'm on, the medication that I'm on is very different than, say, somebody else who's dealing with a similar issue. They may need a totally different medication, totally different dosage, totally different combination. They may need to go into therapy once a week, whereas maybe I'm good once a month. So it varies so much that, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's the fact that there is so much ambiguity and uncertainty there. It makes people very uncomfortable.
So much here, man. There's so much here. I guess my hope is just that maybe listening to this would give people some hope. And my hope is that people would have hope, and courage.
Yeah.
To talk about this more and to seek help, to help others seek help, to become people that advance help in this area, like he said, from the top down, bottom up, and the middle out. Because it's a problem, and we're watching it unfold culturally. Is a huge statistical spectacle. I mean, it's awful what's going on.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of us, for a lot of you probably listening at home, and you're like, well, this is one of those massive problems that I don't know how I can impact it. Kind of like people talk about voting. You're like, well, I'm just one vote, in this sea of millions and millions of people. Well, I think where it starts and where you can help is helping to dispel the stigma in your own sphere of influence. Meaning, for me personally, it took me months before I even admitted to my own the Bible study group I was going to at the time that I was on medication for depression, that I had sought help, that I had tried everything and nothing was working, and so I needed to try some medication and go that route. And years later, I'm like, what in the heck? Like, why was I so afraid to tell people? Like, I wouldn't do the same thing if I had like I said, if I had strep throat,
like diabetes
or whatever. Like I'd be like, yeah, guys, I went in and got medication. I'm feeling way better, So I think that's where we start, and that's where you can start as an individual in a sea of people. As you start there, and we start having honest conversations about mental health and mental illness, and say, yeah, it's okay. Like a lot of people are impacted, and not just people who struggle with it, but maybe you have friends and family members who struggle with some form of mental illness, and that's okay. And the more that we start to talk about it and dispel some of the misnomers and the misconceptions, the more help that's going to be, and the better this is going to get, hopefully in the future.
Right. We're not going to be able to tackle like all of mental illness, but we can tackle that other kind of madness, which is the stigma and the silence, which is why I love the title of his book. The other kind of madness is to not talk about it. The other kind of madness is to repress it. And if you're out there and you're struggling with mental illness and you're not able to talk about it, please, just grab somebody's hand, reach out to somebody, even if it's a hotline or, something. I think John's got the number here, and break that other kind of madness. That is within your control to do that.
Yeah, if you or someone around you, is in a dark enough place and you feel like, you're going to hurt yourself or someone's going to hurt themselves, there is a suicide hotline, at least in the United States. It's 1-800-273-8255. Please call that. There are people, it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's somebody there that can help you. But please seek help. And as always, it's been an honor, a privilege for us to be able to bring somebody to you like this. Hopefully it benefited you in some way and helped. And as always, the band this week is...
Yeah, who are these sweet tunes?
Hidden Hospitals. Some talented young lads. The music is awesome. Really big fan. So I was really happy to be able to use them for this episode. So if you like their music, please go out and support them. Follow them on social media. All that stuff will be in the show notes. And of course, like when we put it out on social media, we'll give them a nice shout out and stuff. So follow our playlist on Spotify. And our podcast is actually on Spotify now. So
yay!
Just another place where you can find us.
And thanks for everybody that's supporting us on Patreon and all those other ways. We love you guys so much. Anybody that's listening to the show or engaging in it or just having conversations of your own out there, not letting somebody take the journey for you, but taking it on your own. And it can be scary, but man, is it fun and exhilarating. And find some community, and we're glad we get to be a part of yours. For now, we are your hosts. I'm Adam Narlock.
And I'm John Williamson.
Keep deconstructing, everybody.
Prescription products require completion of an online medication consultation with an independent healthcare provider through the LifeMD platform and are only available if prescribed. Subscription required. Individual results may vary. Additional restrictions apply at lifemd.com. Read all warnings before using GLP-1s. Side effects may include a risk of thyroid C-cell tumors. Do not use GLP-1s if you or your family have a history of thyroid cancer.
If you've struggled for years to lose weight and have given up hope, did you know you can now access GLP-1 prescription medications through LifeMD? LifeMD is now offering eligible patients online access to GLP-1s, the breakthrough prescription medication that can help you lose body fat and weight. Listen to what people are saying.
I've been able to live my normal lifestyle, and I've lost 20 pounds already. Changed my life.
I wasn't expecting it to shut off the food noise. This was life-altering, and if I can do it, I feel like anybody can do it.
And here's the best part. Your insurance may cover 100% of the cost of your medication. So go to TryLifeMD.com to have your eligibility checked right now. Get started today at TryLifeMD.com. That's TryLifeMD.com.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.